You said she was just a temporary replacement. Julian. So why does she look like she owns the room more than you do? The words cut through the ballroom like shattered glass, and for a split second, every conversation died. Crystal chandeliers hung above in perfect silence, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors, designer gowns, and $1,000 suits. But all eyes were locked on one woman standing alone at the center of all. Elena Hart did not flinch. Not when the laughter rippled softly across the crowd. Not when a woman in front of her, Charlotte Voss, lifted her chin with that practiced, effortless cruelty that only comes from years of never being told no. A thin line of red wine dripped from the edge of Elena's dress where Charlotte had just accidentally spilled it, the deep crimson staining pale fabric like a warning no one else seemed to notice. Elena simply looked down at the stain, then back up, her expression unreadable, almost calm in a way that did not belong in a room like this. Across the room, Julian Cross stood frozen, one hand still holding a glass he had not lifted in minutes, his jaw tightening as whispers spread like wildfire. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. Not when he had carefully orchestrated every detail. Not when Elena was only supposed to be a role, a solution, a temporary answer to a problem he could not control. 7 hours earlier, none of this existed. The night had begun with a simple proposition delivered in a quiet office overlooking the city skyline. Julian had not looked at her when he said it. I need a fiancé, just for one night. I will pay you $50,000. Elena had not answered right away. She had studied him instead, as if measuring something far beyond money, beyond desperation. Then she smiled, soft, almost curious. Just one night, she asked. He nodded once. Clean, simple, controlled. That was the deal. And now here they were, standing inside one of the most exclusive charity galas in New York, surrounded by the very people Julian had spent his entire life trying to impress, and somehow everything was slipping out of his control. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The music resumed, soft and distant, but the tension did not leave the room. Charlotte stepped closer, her voice lowering just enough to sound polite while still cutting deep. You really thought you could come here and pretend to be someone you are not? She said, her eyes scanning Elena from head to toe, lingering on every detail that did not match her standards. Girls like you do not belong in places like this. A few guests chuckled under their breath. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Elena tilted her head slightly, as if considering the statement, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress where the stains still spread. For a moment, it looked like she might step back, apologize, disappear into the background like everyone expected her to. But instead, she did something far more unsettling. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks for approval, but the kind that suggests she knows something no one else does. Julian felt it then, a shift he could not explain, like the air itself had changed direction. Because the woman he had hired to pretend was not acting like someone who was pretending at all. The smile did not leave Elena's lips, but something in her eyes shifted, quiet and deliberate, as if she had just made a decision no one else in the room was aware of. Charlotte let out a soft laugh, the kind designed to invite others to join, and a few did, eager to align themselves with power they understood. Look at you, Charlotte continued, circling slightly as if inspecting a display. Wearing a dress you cannot afford, standing next to a man you barely know, pretending to belong in a world that would never accept you. The words landed harder this time, not because they were louder, but because they were meant to define Elena in front of everyone who mattered. Julian finally moved, stepping forward, his voice low but controlled. That is enough, Charlotte. But even as he said it, there was hesitation in him, a pause that did not go unnoticed. Charlotte's eyes flicked toward him, amused. Is it? She asked. Or are you just embarrassed that your little performance is falling apart? The crowd leaned in, subtle but unmistakable, drawn to the tension like gravity. Elena turned her head slightly toward Julian, studying him for a brief moment, as if weighing something invisible. There was no anger in her expression, no desperation, only a quiet understanding that seemed far older than the situation itself. That was what unsettled him the most. Because this was not how someone in her position was supposed to react. This was not how a woman who needed $50,000 was supposed to stand. Hours earlier, when Elena had first walked into Julian's office, she had looked completely different. Not weaker, not uncertain, but smaller somehow, like she had chosen to take up less space in a world that had never offered her much room to begin with. The city skyline stretched behind Julian's desk, glass and steel cutting into the evening sky, and he had expected her to be intimidated by it. Most people were. But Elena had only glanced at it once before focusing on him. "What exactly do you need from me?" she had asked, her tone calm, almost professional. Julian had explained the situation in simple terms. His family expected him to announce an engagement. Investors were watching. The board was pressuring him. Charlotte had made it clear she intended to return, not out of love, but out of strategy. "I need control of the narrative," he had said, "just for one night." Elena had listened without interrupting, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the chair before she sat down. "And after tonight?" she asked. "We walk away," Julian replied. "No strings, no expectations." She had nodded slowly, then glanced at the small velvet box he placed on the table between them. Inside, the ring caught the light, sharp and brilliant, a symbol of something that was never meant to be real. Elena had not reached for it immediately. Instead, she had asked one question that lingered now in Julian's mind like an echo. "Do you always solve your problems by pretending?" He had not answered. He had not needed to, because the deal had already been made the moment he offered the money. Back in the ballroom, that same ring now rested on Elena's finger, gleaming under the chandelier light, drawing the attention of more than just Charlotte. A few guests whispered, recognizing its design, its origin, its significance within circles far more exclusive than this event. Charlotte noticed it too, her expression tightening for the first time. "Interesting choice," she said, her voice losing a fraction of its ease. "Do you even know what you are wearing?" Elena glanced down at the ring, turning her hand slightly as if seeing it for the first time. Then she looked back at Charlotte, her smile returning, softer now, but far more dangerous. "Yes," she said quietly. "Ido." And for the first time since the confrontation began, the room did not feel like it belonged to Charlotte anymore. The silence that followed Elena's quiet answer did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like something unseen had just shifted beneath the surface, and no one in the room fully understood it yet. Charlotte's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so subtle most would have missed it, but not Julian. He saw it, just as he saw the way several guests began whispering again, this time not with amusement, but with curiosity. Because the ring Elena wore was not just expensive. It was recognizable, not to everyone, but to the right people. And in a room like this, the right people were always watching. Charlotte recovered quickly, her posture straightening as she let out a soft, dismissive laugh. "Confidence is impressive," she said, her voice smooth again, though sharper now. "Delusion is less so." She stepped closer, lowering her tone, so it felt more personal, more cutting. "You really think wearing something like that makes you equal to people who built this world?" Elena did not step back. She did not even blink. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, her posture relaxing as if the tension around her no longer applied. "No," she said calmly. "I did not think that." Charlotte tilted her head, almost intrigued despite herself. "Good," she replied. "At least you understand your place." Elena's gaze moved past her then, briefly scanning the room, taking in the architecture, the people, the subtle details most overlooked. When her eyes returned to Charlotte, there was something new behind them. Not defiance, not anger, recognition. "I understand it very well," Elena said. Across the room, Julian felt a strange unease settle in his chest. He had hired her because she seemed adaptable, because she could play a role convincingly, because she needed what he was offering. But this was not adaptation. This was control, and he had no idea when that shift had happened. One of the older men near the bar leaned toward another, whispering, something that caused both of them to glance toward Elena's hand again. A woman near the stage subtly adjusted her stance, suddenly paying closer attention. These were not random guests. These were people who understood symbols, who recognized influence not by volume, but by precision. Charlotte noticed the change in energy too, and it irritated her more than she expected. She reached out suddenly, her fingers brushing Elena's wrist as if to inspect the ring more closely. But the gesture carried something sharper beneath it, a need to reassert dominance. "Tell me," Charlotte said, her voice tightening just enough to betray her. "Where exactly did you get this?" For the first time, Elena looked down at Charlotte's hand on her wrist. Not startled, not offended, just aware. Then she slowly lifted her gaze back up, her expression soft but unyielding. "It was given to me," she said. Charlotte let out a quiet scoff. Of course it was, but she did not let go immediately, and that hesitation spoke louder than her words. Because somewhere, beneath the surface of her certainty, doubt had begun to form. Julian stepped forward again, this time more firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "That is enough." He reached for Elena's hand, gently but decisively pulling it away from Charlotte's grasp. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not intimacy, not yet, but awareness. Because for the first time since this arrangement began, Julian realized he was no longer the one in control of how this night would end. Elena turned slightly toward him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You wanted control of the narrative," she said quietly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Sometimes control is not about speaking first." Julian frowned slightly, trying to understand what she meant, but before he could respond, Elena stepped forward, moving past him and toward the center of the room. Not hurried, not hesitant, intentional. Conversations began to quiet again as people noticed her movement, as attention shifted without being commanded. Charlotte remained where she was, her composure intact on the surface, but her eyes sharper now, tracking Elena with a focus that had lost its earlier arrogance. Because something about this was no longer predictable. An unpredictability in a room built on power and perception was the most dangerous thing of all. Elena's heels echoed softly against the marble as she walked forward, each step measured, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world while the rest of the room held its breath. The low hum of conversation faded again, replaced by a quiet tension that spread outward like ripples in still water. People turned, one by one, not because she demanded attention, but because something about her presence made it impossible to look away. Julian remained where he stood for a moment, watching her, his mind racing through every detail he thought he understood about this situation and finding none of it aligned with what he was seeing now. This was supposed to be simple, a controlled appearance, a temporary illusion. But Elena did not look like an illusion. She looked like the only real thing in the room. Charlotte followed a few steps behind, slower this time, her confidence no longer effortless, her eyes narrowing as she tried to regain control of a narrative that was slipping through her fingers. Near the center of the ballroom, a small group of board members stood in conversation, their voices low, their posture relaxed in the way of people who held power without needing to display it. As Elena approached, one of them, an older man with silver hair and a quiet presence, turned toward her. For a brief second, his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as recognition flickered across his face. He straightened slightly, his conversation halting mid-sentence. The others noticed his change and followed his gaze. Elena stopped just within their circle, not intruding, not asking, simply existing in the space as if she had always belonged there. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm, warm, and steady. The silver-haired man inclined his head almost instinctively. "Good evening," he replied, his tone respectful in a way that did not go unnoticed by the others. Charlotte reached them just in time to hear that shift, and it unsettled her more than anything that had happened so far. Respect like that was not given lightly. It was earned, or was recognized, and she was certain Elena had earned nothing in this room. "I see you have found new company," Charlotte said, forcing a lightness into her voice that did not quite land. The group glanced between the two women, sensing the tension but not yet understanding its source. Elena did not turn immediately. She allowed a small pause, then faced Charlotte with the same composed expression. "I was just saying hello," she said. Simple, neutral, but the effect was anything but. One of the board members, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a measured demeanor, studied Elena more closely now. Her gaze dropped briefly to the ring, then returned to Elena's face. "That is a remarkable piece," she said, her tone thoughtful rather than impressed. "It is not something one sees often." Elena met her gaze without hesitation. "No," she replied. "It is not." The woman nodded slightly, as if confirming something only she understood. Julian finally stepped closer, drawn in by a growing sense that he was missing something critical, something that everyone else was beginning to notice. "Elena," he said quietly, a question hidden in her name. She turned to him then, and for the first time since the night began, there was a softness in her expression, not weakness, but something more personal, more human. "You should listen," she said gently. "People tell you who they are, even when they're not speaking directly to you." Before Julian could respond, Charlotte let out a sharper laugh, unable to contain her frustration any longer. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw more attention. "We are standing here entertaining a fantasy." She gestured toward Elena, her tone cutting again. "She is not part of this world. She never will be." The words hung in the air, bold and certain, but this time they did not carry the same weight, because the room had already begun to shift. The silver-haired man glanced at Charlotte, then back at Elena, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. The woman beside him remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the ring. And Julian, standing between two versions of reality, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Doubt, not about Elena, but about everything he thought he understood about the people around him. Elena let the silence stretch just a moment longer, then spoke again, her voice steady and quiet, yet somehow carrying farther than Charlotte's had. "Belonging is an interesting concept," she said. "Most people think it is given. It is not." She paused, her gaze sweeping briefly across the group, then returning to Charlotte. "It is recognized," and in that moment, more than one person in the room began to realize they might already be recognizing her. The shift in the room did not happen all at once, but it was undeniable, like a slow current pulling everything in a new direction without asking permission. Conversations that had once flowed easily now paused mid-sentence, eyes drifting back toward Elena as if drawn by something deeper than curiosity. The board members standing before her were no longer simply observing. They were assessing, recalibrating, recognizing patterns that did not fit the narrative they had been given. Julian felt it most of all, the subtle but powerful change in how people looked at Elena, and then at him, as if the roles between them were no longer as clear as they had seemed just hours ago. Charlotte, however, refused to accept it. She straightened her shoulders, her composure returning with a sharp edge, the kind that came from years of winning simply because no one dared challenge her. "Enough of this," she said, her voice cutting clean through the quiet tension. "You are all being distracted by performance." She stepped closer again, positioning herself between Elena and the group, reclaiming space as if it were her right. "This is exactly what she wants," Charlotte continued. "Attention, confusion, a chance to pretend she belongs somewhere she clearly does not." The words were confident, but they no longer landed with the same certainty. The silver-haired man did not respond. The woman beside him did not agree. Instead, their silence became its own kind of answer. Elena watched Charlotte for a moment, her expression thoughtful, almost sympathetic, as if she understood something Charlotte did not yet see. Then, slowly, she reached up and adjusted the ring on her finger, turning it just enough for the light to catch the engraving hidden along its inner band. It was a small movement, subtle enough that only a few noticed, but those who did felt its significance immediately. The woman with sharp eyes leaned forward slightly, her gaze narrowing as she recognized the detail. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly. "That engraving," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The silver-haired man followed her gaze, his posture shifting again, this time with unmistakable gravity. Julian frowned, his attention snapping toward Elena's hand, realizing there were layers here he had never considered, details he had overlooked because he believed he was the one controlling the situation. Charlotte noticed the shift too, and irritation flickered into something closer to unease. "What is it now?" she demanded, her tone sharper than before. "Another trick?" Elena lowered her hand slowly, her gaze steady as it met Charlotte's. "No," she said softly, "not a trick." The woman beside the silver-haired man spoke then, her voice calm but firm, carrying a weight that immediately quieted the last remaining whispers. "Where did you get that ring?" she asked, her eyes locked onto Elena's. It was no longer a question of curiosity. It was a question of authority. Elena held her gaze, unflinching. "It has been in my family for a long time," she replied. The words were simple, but the reaction they caused was not. The silver-haired man exhaled slowly, as if confirming something that had been forming in his mind. He glanced briefly at the others, then back at Elena, his voice lowering with a respect that could not be faked. "That would mean," he began, but did not finish. He did not need to, because the realization was already spreading. Charlotte's expression tightened, her confidence cracking at the edges. "This is absurd," she said quickly, too quickly. "Anyone can make a claim like that." But her voice no longer held the same control. Julian stepped closer to Elena, his voice quieter now, no longer commanding, but searching. "Elena," he said, his eyes scanning her face as if seeing her for the first time. "What is going on?" Elena turned toward him, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them in a silence filled with everything he had not asked and everything she had not said. "You asked me to pretend," she said gently. "So I did." Julian shook his head slightly, confusion and realization colliding. "This is not pretending," he said under his breath. Elena's expression softened, but there was something resolute beneath it now, something that had always been there, waiting. "No," she agreed quietly. Then she looked back toward the group, toward Charlotte, toward the room that was no longer laughing. It never was. And in that moment, the illusion did not break. It reversed. The room did not return to normal after Elena's last words. It tightened, like a held breath that no one dared release. Because now something far more dangerous than embarrassment had entered the space. Uncertainty, and in a world built on certainty, that alone was enough to shift power. Charlotte took a step back without realizing it, her posture still upright, but no longer anchored, her eyes flicking between Elena and the board members as if searching for confirmation that this was still her stage. But no one gave it to her. The silver-haired man cleared his throat softly, his gaze steady on Elena now, no longer questioning, but measuring with a kind of quiet respect that came from experience. "Your family," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, "would not happen to be connected to Heart Holdings." The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room that reached far beyond the small circle they stood in. Conversations nearby stopped completely. Even those who had not been paying attention before turned now, drawn by a name that carried weight across industries, across cities, across generations. Julian felt it hit him a second later, recognition striking with a force that made his chest tighten. Heart Holdings was not just another company. It was the foundation beneath several of the largest developments his own firm depended on, a silent force that rarely appeared in public, but controlled more than most people realized. Slowly, almost deliberately, Elena inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "No explanation. No elaboration. Just confirmation." The simplicity of it made it even more undeniable. Charlotte let out a short, sharp laugh, but lacked conviction. "That is impossible," she said quickly. "The Hart family does not attend events like this without making it known." Her voice rose slightly, as if volume alone could restore control. "Everyone here would know." The woman with sharp eyes spoke again, her tone calm but firm. "Not necessarily," she said. "Not if they did not want to be recognized." Charlotte's lips parted, but no words came immediately. Because for the first time, doubt was not just forming. It was visible. Julian took a step closer to Elena, his voice low, almost careful now. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked. It was not an accusation. It was something else. A question shaped by everything he was beginning to understand too late. Elena turned to him, her expression steady, but there was a quiet honesty in her eyes now. That had not been there before. "You did not ask," she replied. The answer was simple, but it carried more weight than anything else said that night. Julian let out a slow breath, his mind replaying every moment since they met, every assumption he had made, every detail he had overlooked because he believed he understood the rules. "I thought I did," he said quietly. Elena shook her head slightly. "You asked what you needed," she said. "Not who I am." The distinction settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Around them, the energy continued to shift. Guests who had once stood at a comfortable distance now moved closer, drawn not by spectacle, but by significance. Names like Hart Holdings did not appear in conversations like this by accident. They appeared when something real was happening. Charlotte straightened again, forcing control back in her posture, her voice tightening into something sharper. "Even if that were true," she said, stepping forward once more, "it changes nothing. You are still standing here because he brought you here." She gestured toward Julian, clinging to the last version of reality she could control. "You are still pretending." Elena looked at her for a long moment, and this time there was no softness in her expression, no quiet patience. Just clarity. "No," she said, her voice calm but absolute. "He is." The words landed harder than anything before them. Julian froze, the meaning settling in before he could stop it. Because suddenly, the narrative he had built, the control he thought he held, the role he believed he was directing, all of it shifted in a single moment. Charlotte's composure broke, just slightly, just enough to show. "That is ridiculous," she said, but the room did not agree. Because now, for the first time, people were not looking at Elena as an outsider trying to belong. They were looking at her as someone who had never needed permission in the first place. And Julian, standing beside her, realized something even more unsettling. He had not brought her into this world. She had stepped into it on her own terms, and he had never even noticed. The impact of Elena's words did not fade. It deepened, settling into the room like a truth no one could ignore anymore. "He is." The sentence lingered in the air, quiet but devastating, because it did not just challenge Julian, it redefined him in front of everyone who mattered. For the first time in a very long time, Julian Cross was not the center of control. He was the one being seen, measured, and silently questioned. Charlotte felt it slipping completely now, the narrative she had built cracking under the weight of something she could no longer dismiss. Her gaze hardened, desperation sharpening her tone as she stepped forward again, refusing to let the moment settle. "You are trying to twist reality," she said, her voice tight, controlled only by force. "Everyone here knows who Julian is. Everyone knows what he built." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the surrounding guests, pulling them into her argument as if they were her shield. "This company, this influence, this entire room exists because of him." The words were strong, practiced, but they did not land the way they once would have. Because now people were thinking, and thinking was dangerous. Elena did not respond immediately. She allowed Charlotte's statement to hang, to echo, to reveal its own limitations. Then she spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying a precision that cut deeper than any raised tone. "He leads it," she said. "That is true." A small pause followed, just long enough for the distinction to form before she completed it. "But he does not own it." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Not dramatic, not explosive, just absolute. A few people shifted where they stood. Others exchanged brief glances, calculations already forming behind their eyes. Because ownership in a room like this was everything. Julian felt the words before he fully understood them, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with realization. His name was on the building. His decisions shaped the company. But ownership had always been more complicated, layered through trusts, holdings, and agreements that extended beyond his direct control. He had known that. He had just never felt it. Until now. That is not how this works, Charlotte said quickly, her voice rising again. But now it carried something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. You cannot just walk in here and claim something like that. Elena's gaze shifted briefly toward her, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply steady. I'm not claiming anything, she said. I'm clarifying. The difference landed. The silver-haired man nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming a conclusion he had already reached. The woman beside him folded her arms slowly, her attention no longer divided. Around them, the room had fully turned. Conversations had stopped completely now. People were no longer pretending this was just another social moment. This was something else. Something real. Julian took a step forward, his voice lower than before, stripped of its usual authority, replaced by something more honest. Why tonight? He asked, his eyes fixed on Elena. Why now? Elena looked at him, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not because the tension had disappeared, but because the truth was finally standing where the performance had been. Because you needed someone to stand beside you, she said quietly, and I needed to see who you would be when it mattered. Julian's breath caught slightly, the weight of that statement settling in ways he had not prepared for. And now you have, he said. It was not a question. Elena held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. Yes, she said. Charlotte let out a sharp breath, unable to contain it any longer. This is absurd, she said again, but the word had lost its power. No one responded. No one agreed, because the room had already moved past her. Elena took a slow step back, not retreating, but repositioning as if she no longer needed to prove anything. Her presence alone had done that. And Julian, standing in the center of a world he thought he controlled, realized something that unsettled him more than any public humiliation ever could. He had not failed because of Charlotte. He had failed because when the moment came, he had hesitated, and Elena had not. The silence that followed Elena's final answer did not break. It stretched, long and suffocating, until it forced something else to surface. Movement. Not from the crowd, not from the board members, but from Charlotte. Because for the first time that night, she realized she was losing not just control, but relevance. And that was something she could not accept. You think this changes anything? Charlotte said sharply, stepping forward again, her voice cutting through the stillness like a last attempt to reclaim the room. You walk in here with a name, with a story, and suddenly everyone forgets who actually built this company. Her gaze snapped toward Julian, pulling him back into the center of the conflict, whether he was ready or not. You know what she is doing? She pressed, her tone lower now, more personal, more dangerous. She is playing you, just like everyone else who sees what you have. The words hit harder than her earlier insults, not because they were louder, but because they were aimed precisely where doubt had already begun to form. Julian did not answer right away. His eyes remained on Elena, searching, not for confirmation of power, but for something else. Truth. Is that what you think? He asked quietly, his voice no longer carrying authority, but weight. Charlotte scoffed softly. It is obvious, she replied. No one walks into a situation like this without an agenda. Elena watched the exchange without interrupting, her expression unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in her posture now, a quiet withdrawal, as if she had already made a decision that no one else had caught up to yet. Everyone has an agenda, she said finally, her voice calm but distant. Including you. Charlotte's lips tightened, but she did not respond. Because for once, the statement did not feel like an attack. It felt like a mirror. Julian exhaled slowly, the weight of the night pressing down in ways he had not anticipated. Then tell me yours, he said, his eyes fixed on Elena. It was not a demand. It was a request. Elena held his gaze for a moment, and something in her softened, not in weakness, but in finality. I already did, she said quietly. You just did not listen. The words landed deeper than anything Charlotte had said, because they were not meant to wound. They were meant to close something. A door. A possibility. Around them, the room had gone completely still again, but this time it was not anticipation. It was realization, the kind that comes too late. Charlotte sensed it too, and for the first time, she did not push forward. She watched instead, her eyes sharp, calculating, waiting to see how this would end. Because no matter what Elena had revealed, there was still one thing left unresolved. Julian's choice. Elena took a small step back, creating space between them, her voice steady but softer now. You asked me to stand beside you, she said. Not to lead, not to speak, just to be there. Julian nodded slightly, remembering the exact words, the exact control he had tried to maintain. And when it mattered, Elena continued, you chose silence. The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be, because everyone in the room had seen it. The hesitation, the moment he did not act, the moment that defined everything that followed. Julian looked down briefly, the truth of it settling in without defense, without excuse. I thought I was protecting the situation, he said quietly. Elena shook her head gently. You were protecting yourself, she replied. The distinction was sharp, undeniable. Charlotte let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite relief, but something in between. Because for the first time since the shift began, the focus was no longer on her. It was on him, and that was where she knew he was weakest. Julian lifted his gaze again, meeting Elena's eyes, and this time there was no confusion in his expression, only clarity. And now, he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried everything that had not been said. Elena studied him for a moment, as if weighing not his words, but his actions, his silence, his hesitation. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Now, she said softly, you decide who you want to be when people are watching. The room did not move. No one spoke, because this was no longer about status or power or ownership. It was about something far more dangerous in a room like this. Accountability. And Julian Cross, for the first time in his life, stood at the center of it without a script. No one moved when Elena finished speaking, but something inside the room had already begun to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way power shifts when truth is no longer negotiable. Julian stood still, her words settling into him, heavier with each passing second, because for the first time, there was no distraction, no strategy, no carefully controlled narrative to hide behind. Just a choice. Charlotte watched him closely, her expression tightening as she realized this moment was slipping beyond her influence, but she was not ready to let it go. Do not do this, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence again, but this time it lacked the effortless control she once carried. Do not let her turn this into something it is not. Julian did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Elena, as if everything else in the room had faded into the background. It already is something, he said quietly. Charlotte took a step closer, her tone shifting, softer now, more calculated. You know me, she said. You know how this world works. This is not about feelings. It is about control, about perception. That is what matters. Julian's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not respond immediately, because for the first time, those words did not feel like guidance. They felt like a limitation. Elena remained where she was, watching him without pressure, without expectation, but there was something in her stillness that made the moment impossible to escape. She was not asking him to choose her. She was asking him to choose himself. And that was far more difficult. You are right, Julian said finally, his voice calm but steady. Charlotte's expression shifted, a flicker of relief crossing her face too quickly. Of course I am, she replied. That is why you brought me back. Because you know I understand what is at stake. Julian shook his head slowly. No, he said. You are right about how this world works. He paused, his gaze lifting slightly, taking in the room, the people, the expectations that had shaped every decision he had ever made. Then he looked back at Elena. But that does not mean it is how it should work. The sentence landed like a crack through glass, quiet but irreversible. Charlotte's relief vanished instantly. replaced by something sharper, more desperate. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice rising despite herself. "You are letting one moment, one performance, change everything you built." Julian exhaled slowly, the weight of that statement settling in, but this time it did not anchor him. It freed him. "No," he said, "I'm finally seeing what I built." The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Around them, the room seemed to lean in, not physically, but in attention, because this was no longer about Elena's reveal. It was about Julian's response. Elena's eyes softened slightly, not in triumph, but in recognition, as if she had already known what he would say, or perhaps what he could become. Charlotte stepped forward again, her control slipping further now, her voice sharper, more emotional. "And what about everything we planned?" she pressed. "What? About the future we agreed on?" Julian looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity. "That was never a future," he said quietly. "It was a strategy." The words hit harder than any insult. Charlotte froze, her expression tightening as the meaning settled in, not just for her, but for everyone listening. Because in a room built on alliances and appearances, being reduced to a strategy was the ultimate loss of power. Elena took a small step back, giving space to the moment, because this was not hers to control anymore. It was his. Julian turned slightly, facing the room now, his posture straightening, not with arrogance, but with decision. "There will be no announcement tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, quiet but undeniable. "No engagement," he continued. "No performance." Charlotte's breath caught, her composure breaking just enough to be seen. "You cannot do that," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Do you understand what this will cost you?" Julian met her gaze one last time, and this time there was no conflict in his expression. "Yes," he said simply. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "And I am willing to pay it." The room fell completely silent, because in that moment, the balance had fully shifted. Not through power, not through wealth, but through choice. And for the first time that night, Julian Cross was no longer playing a role. The silence that followed Julian's declaration did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of consequences no one in the room could fully predict. A low murmur spread across the ballroom, subtle at first, then growing as reality caught up with what had just happened. Deals, expectations, alliances, all of them had just shifted in a single moment, and everyone present understood that nothing about this night would remain contained within these walls. Charlotte stood frozen, her composure no longer just cracked, but visibly breaking, the weight of public rejection settling over her in a way she had never experienced before. "You are throwing everything away," she said, her voice quieter now, but far more intense, stripped of performance and filled with something real. "For what?" Julian did not answer immediately. His gaze moved across the room, taking in the people who had once defined success for him, the ones whose approval had shaped his decisions, his strategies, his life. Then he turned back, not to Charlotte, but to Elena. "For clarity," he said simply. The word was not dramatic, but it carried more conviction than anything else he had said that night. Charlotte let out a breath that trembled despite her effort to control it. "You think clarity will protect you?" she asked. "This world does not reward honesty. It rewards control." Elena watched quietly, her expression calm, but there was a subtle shift in her posture now, as if she were preparing for something beyond the moment. "Control without understanding always fails," she said softly, not challenging Charlotte, but completing the thought. The room grew quieter again, not because people were confused, but because they were listening, truly listening now. The silver-haired man stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone respectful but direct, "if what you are implying is accurate, then there are implications far beyond this evening." Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "There are," she replied, "and they were always there. The honesty in her voice carried no arrogance, only certainty. The woman beside him nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Then perhaps it is time those implications are acknowledged," she said. The words were calm, but they landed with authority, signaling a shift that extended beyond personal conflict into something institutional, something that could not be ignored. Charlotte's head snapped toward them, disbelief flashing across her face. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice rising again. "You are all just going to accept this without question?" The silver-haired man did not raise his voice, but his response carried more weight than any protest. "We are not accepting anything," he said. "We are recognizing what is already evident." Charlotte shook her head, stepping back as if the ground beneath her had changed. "This is not how it works," she insisted. "You do not just walk in and take control." Elena's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not taking anything," she said. "I am returning." The word settled into the room with quiet finality. Returning. Not arriving. Not claiming. Returning. Julian felt it then, the full realization of what that meant, not just for the company, but for everything he thought he understood about his role within it. "You were never just passing through," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Elena glanced at him, a faint, almost knowing expression touching her features. "No," she said. Charlotte's hands curled slightly at her sides, her control slipping entirely now, replaced by something raw and unfiltered. "This is not over," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You think you have won something tonight, but this world does not forgive shifts like this." Elena held her gaze, unshaken. "I'm not looking for forgiveness," she replied. "Only alignment." The word lingered, unfamiliar yet precise, and for a moment, no one responded. Because alignment meant something different. It meant truth meeting structure. It meant reality replacing illusion. And that was far more disruptive than any scandal. Julian stepped forward then, his voice steady, no longer uncertain. "Then let it shift," he said. The statement was simple, but it carried a willingness that changed everything. Charlotte looked at him one last time, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything she could use to regain control. But she found none. And for the first time in her life, she realized she had already lost, not because someone took something from her, but because the foundation she stood on had never been as solid as she believed. Around them, the room began to move again, but differently now. Conversations quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone understood they were witnessing the beginning of something that would not be undone. And at the center of it all, Elena Hart did not claim the moment. She simply stood in it, as if she had been there all along. The ballroom did not erupt after Elena's quiet declaration. It transformed, the kind of shift that only happens when power rearranges itself without needing to announce it. Conversations resumed, but they were no longer light or performative. They were measured, strategic, recalculated in real time as every person in the room began adjusting their understanding of who truly held influence. The silver-haired man stepped forward again, this time with clear intent, his presence drawing attention without raising his voice. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone formal yet unmistakably respectful. "There are matters that require immediate clarification." Elena inclined her head slightly. "There always are," she replied. The exchange was simple, but the meaning beneath it was not. This was no longer a social interaction. It was the beginning of transition. Charlotte stood at the edge of it all, no longer the center, no longer the voice that directed the room, and for the first time, she did not speak. Because she understood something now that she had refused to see before. This was not a situation she could dominate. It was one she had already lost. Julian remained still for a moment longer, watching Elena as the world he knew began to reorganize around her presence. Not because she demanded it, but because it recognized her. That was the difference. And that difference changed everything. He stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them. His voice lower now, stripped of the authority he once relied on, replaced by something far more difficult to hold. "Honesty. I owe you an apology," he said. The words were not loud, But in a room like this, they carried farther than any declaration of power. Elena turned toward him, her expression calm, but attentive. She did not interrupt. She did not soften the moment. She let it exist exactly as it was. I assumed, Julian continued, his voice steady but deliberate, that I understood the situation, that I understood you. He paused briefly, the weight of that admission settling not just within him, but across the room where others listened without appearing to. I was wrong. The simplicity of it made it stronger. No excuses. No deflection. Just truth. Elena studied him for a moment, her gaze searching not for perfection, but for sincerity. You were not entirely wrong, she said quietly. You just saw what was convenient. Julian exhaled slowly, the words landing with a clarity he could not avoid. And now, he asked, his tone no longer demanding direction, but seeking understanding. Elena glanced briefly around the room, taking in the shifting alliances, the recalculations already forming, the subtle repositioning of power that would continue long after this night ended. And she looked back at him. Now, she said, things become honest. The word carried weight, not as an ideal, but as a consequence. Nearby, the woman with sharp eyes stepped closer, her posture composed, her voice measured. If that is the case, she said, addressing Elena directly, then the board will need to convene sooner than expected. The implication was clear. This was no longer speculation. It was action. Elena nodded once. I will be available, she replied. The silver-haired man inclined his head again, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than deference, and stepped back, already considering the implications beyond the room. Charlotte finally moved, not forward, but backward, her heels soft against the marble as she created distance between herself and the center she once controlled. Her expression had changed completely now. The sharpness remained, but it was quieter, colder, recalculating rather than reacting. She had not disappeared. She had adapted, and that meant she was not finished. Julian noticed it, but for the first time, he did not respond to it, because his focus had shifted. It was no longer on managing perception or maintaining control. It was on understanding something he had overlooked entirely. Elena turned slightly, as if preparing to leave the center of the room now that the moment had passed, but Julian spoke again, his voice stopping her without force. Elena. She paused, glancing back at him. There was no tension in the movement, no expectation, just awareness. When you said you needed to see who I would be, he continued, did I fail? The question was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything else he had asked that night. Because this time, it was not about business. It was personal. Elena held his gaze for a moment, considering not just his words, but everything that had led to them. You hesitated, she said honestly. That is not the same as failing. Julian absorbed that, the distinction settling into him with unexpected depth. But it is not enough, he said. Elena gave a small nod. Not yet. The honesty between them was no longer sharp. It was clear, and clarity, unlike power, could not be taken or performed. It had to be earned. Around them, the room continued to move, but differently now, more aware, more deliberate, as if everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would not be undone. And as Elena finally turned to step away from the center, she did not look like someone leaving. She looked like someone moving forward into a reality that had always been hers, whether anyone else recognized it or not. The ballroom did not feel the same anymore. Not after everything that had been said, not after everything that had been revealed. The music continued, soft and distant, but it no longer defined the atmosphere. What defined it now was awareness. The kind that changes how people stand, how they speak, how they look at one another. Elena moved toward the edge of the room, no longer the center of attention, yet somehow still the axis everything rotated around. She did not rush. She did not look back immediately, because she understood something that most people in that room were only beginning to grasp. Once truth is seen, it does not need to demand attention. It holds it naturally. Julian followed her, not out of obligation, not out of appearance, but because something inside him refused to let the moment end without resolution. "Elena," he called again, his voice steady but quieter now, as if the space between them required something more honest than volume. She stopped this time, turning slowly to face him near the tall glass windows that overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out beneath them like a reminder of everything that had led them here. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was no longer about status or misunderstanding. It was about choice. "You said I hesitated," Julian began, his voice measured, careful not because he lacked confidence, but because he finally understood the weight of his words. "You are right." Elena did not respond. She watched him, not waiting for perfection, but for truth. "I built everything in my life around control," he continued. "Every decision, every partnership, every outcome. I thought if I controlled enough variables, nothing could surprise me." He paused, letting that settle. "But I was wrong." Elena's expression softened slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition. "You were not wrong about control," she said quietly. "You were wrong about what it protects." The words landed gently, but they carried more depth than anything else that night. Julian nodded slowly. "It protected me," he admitted, "from risk, from uncertainty, from being seen for who I actually am." The admission was not dramatic. It did not need to be, because in a room like this, vulnerability was rarer than wealth. Elena stepped a little closer, closing part of the distance, her voice calm but direct. "And who are you?" she asked. The question was simple, but it was not easy. Julian held her gaze, and for a moment, the answer did not come from strategy or expectation. It came from somewhere quieter. "Someone who is still learning," he said. Elena studied him for a moment, as if weighing not the answer, but the honesty behind it. Then she gave a small nod. "That is a start," she said. The city lights reflected in the glass behind her, casting a soft glow that made the moment feel suspended, separate from the rest of the room, from the noise, from the shifting alliances and quiet calculations still unfolding in the background. "You asked me why tonight," Elena continued, her tone thoughtful now. "Why I stepped into your world the way I did." Julian listened, not interrupting, not assuming. "Because this is where truth reveals itself the fastest," she said. "When people think they have something to gain or something to lose." She held his gaze, steady and clear. "Tonight you had both." Julian exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper now, no longer uncomfortable, but necessary. "And I almost chose wrong," he said. Elena shook her head gently. "You paused," she corrected. "Then you chose." The distinction mattered. It always had. For a moment, neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was clear, open, honest in a way neither of them had experienced when this arrangement began. Julian glanced briefly toward the center of the room, where conversations had resumed, where the world continued moving forward, adjusting to a new reality that neither of them could fully control anymore. Then he looked back at her. "What happens now?" he asked. Elena followed his gaze for a moment, then returned her attention to him. "Now," she said softly, "we stop pretending." The words were simple, but they carried everything that had been building since the moment they met. Julian nodded once, the meaning settling into him fully this time. Not as a challenge, not as a risk, but as a decision. And for the first time that night, it was not about power. It was about truth. The night did not end with applause, and it did not need to. Because what had happened inside that ballroom was not a performance that required validation. It was a shift that would echo far beyond the walls long after the lights dimmed. By the time the event began to wind down, the conversations had changed completely. No one spoke about appearances anymore. They spoke about structure, about leadership, about what came next. And at the center of every quiet conversation was one name. Elena Hart. She did not stay to claim attention. She did not linger for recognition. Instead, she stepped away from the crowd, leaving behind a space that no longer belonged to illusion. Julian watched her go for a moment before following, not with urgency, but with intention. Outside, the night air felt different, cooler, clearer, untouched by the tension that had filled the room inside. The city stretched out in front of them, alive and indifferent, a reminder that no matter how powerful a moment felt, the world always continued forward. Elena stood near the edge of the terrace, her gaze resting on the skyline, calm and grounded as if nothing that had happened inside had unsettled her at all. Julian stepped beside her, leaving a respectful distance, no longer assuming closeness, no longer taking space that had not been given. "You are leaving," he said quietly. Elena nodded once. "There is work to do," she replied. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any dramatic farewell. Julian let out a slow breath, understanding now that this was not an ending built on emotion, but on reality. "And what about us?" he asked. The question was honest, but it did not carry expectation. Elena turned her head slightly, her expression thoughtful rather than distant. "There was never an us," she said gently. The words were not cruel. They were clear. Julian absorbed that, not with resistance, but with acceptance. "Not yet," he said after a moment. Elena studied him, and for the first time, there was something in her gaze that resembled possibility, not certainty, but not dismissal either. "Not yet," she agreed. The city lights reflected in her eyes as she continued, her voice calm and steady. "You built something powerful, Julian, but power without alignment will always break under pressure." He nodded slowly, the lesson no longer abstract but lived. "And you?" he asked. "What will you do now?" Elena looked back toward the ballroom for a brief moment, where the future of the company was already beginning to reshape itself. "I will do what should have been done a long time ago," she said. "I will lead it properly." There was no arrogance in her tone, only responsibility. And that was what made it undeniable. Julian felt a quiet respect settle in him, not for her status, but for her clarity. "Then I hope I earn the chance to stand beside you again," he said. Elena did not answer right away. Instead, she reached up and slowly removed the ring from her finger, the same ring that had started as a symbol of a contract, of a lie, of a controlled narrative. She held it for a moment, then placed it gently in Julian's hand. "Next time," she said softly, "do not offer something you do not understand." The words were not a rejection. They were a boundary, a standard. Julian closed his hand around the ring, feeling its weight differently now, no longer as a tool, but as a reminder. "Next time," he replied, "it will not be an offer." Elena gave a small nod, acknowledging the shift in his words, in his understanding. Then she turned and walked away, not slowly, not dramatically, just forward, into the future that had always been hers. Julian remained on the terrace for a moment longer, watching the city, the ring in his hand, the echo of everything that had changed settling into something steady and real. Inside, the company would shift. The power would realign. The world he thought he controlled would evolve into something more honest. And for the first time, he was not afraid of that. Because this time, he was not building control. He was building truth. And somewhere in that truth, he knew one thing with certainty. This was not the end of their story. It was the first time it had ever been real.